Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to special lecture today. Today we are very honored to invite Professor Christine Borgman to be our speaker. Before her lecture, I would like to invite the Academia Sinica Center for Digital Cultures Director Fu Shiling to deliver the opening remarks. Let's welcome Director Ling.
Professor Borgman, Dr. Li, and Dr. Zhuang, and Dr. Yu, ladies and gentlemen, it is both an honor and a privilege to introduce to you today's speaker for the Academia Sinica Special Lecture, Professor Christine Borgman. The Academia Sinica Special Lecture was aimed to invite distinguished scholars from all over the world to share their expertise in areas that intersect with Academia Sinica important research undertakings. It is hoped that the lectures will provide inspiration for faculty members, young scholars, and students in the academy. Professor Borgman is a distinguished professor and a presidential chair in information studies at the University of California, Los Angeles. She directed the Center for Knowledge Infrastructures at UCLA, which focuses on scientific data, practice and policy, and socio-technical systems. Professor Borgman is the author of more than 250 publications in information studies, computer science, and communication. This includes 3 award-winning monographs, all published by MIT Press. 2 of the books published in 2000 and 2007. Each won the Best Information Science Book of the Year award from the Association for Information Science and Technology. Dr. Borgman's most recent book, published in 2015, Big Data, Little Data. A fellow of American Association for the Advancement of Science and the Association for Computing Machinery. She also served on the U.S. National Academy Board on Research Data and Information and the U.S. National Committee for Codata. Yesterday, Professor Borgman delivered a keynote speech at National Taiwan University for the 2016 Data Curation and Citation Workshop jointly organized by Academia Sinica, National Taiwan University, and the National Applied Research Laboratories and Codata Taiwan. Today, we are grateful that Professor Borgman is willing to take time from her busy schedule to visit Academia Sinica and deliver the special lecture. I would also like to take this opportunity to thank Dr. Yu Zhourong, Executive Director of the Center for Survey Research, and Dr. Zhuang Tingrui, Associate Research Fellow of Institute of Information Science for their efforts in organizing this event. We live in a modern world driven by data. Keeping up with and making responsible use of the so-called big data is already a challenge, both for living and for work. Research data is of no exception. Therefore, we are especially grateful for this timely opportunity to have Professor Borgman to share her expertise on the big data phenomena. The title of the lecture is Big Data, Little Data, or No Data, Sustaining Access to Scholarship. Ladies and gentlemen, please give a warm welcome to Professor Christine Borgman.
Thank you.
Thank you. Is the mic on? Okay, good. It is my great honor and pleasure to be back at Academia Sinica. I gave a lecture here some years ago, but not in so grand a room as we have here today. And as you know, the University of California has many partnerships with Academia Sinica, and the latest, of course, is your new president, Professor Lau, has come from my own campus, UCLA. We have many other partnerships, and I thank Professor Shang, Professor Yu, Professor Chuang, Professor Wu, people who have organized this so that I could come and give 3 lectures in a week and reconnect not only with all of you, but with some of my former students from UCLA who are here, and my classmate and office mate from Stanford University, Professor Cheng-Wei Wen, also. So this is quite a bit of a reunion visit, too. I brought a copy of the book, which I will leave for the Academy. Let me pass that around also, if I may. Thank you. Good. So that will be here for your browsing. It is indeed a timely lecture to be thinking about the changing scholarship in this networked world, as so much of research becomes more data intensive, more computing intensive, not only in the physical and life sciences, but in the social sciences and in the humanities as well. And I want to take a broad sweep and cut across those disciplines, but the theme will touch on many parts of this recent book, but I really want to come around to sustaining access to scholarship, which is more critical than ever in large countries and in small countries, because we have even more opportunities to capture the expertise and the knowledge that is produced in countries like Taiwan in ways not only that you can reuse it, that you can share it, that you can leverage it, but in ways that you can demonstrate to the rest of the world the great scholarship, the great riches, the great resources that are here for the rest of us to learn from and to enjoy. Let's start, given that we've opened with digital cultures, to step back about 350 years. This last year and this year are that anniversary of the first English language journal produced in London. The first French journal came out about the same time, a few months earlier. This is the 350th anniversary issue on the right of the same journal. It's the longest continuously published scientific journal. Notice how much has changed and yet how little has changed. We have a title, we have a volume, we have dates, we have statements of responsibility. We even have roughly the same size and shape of the journals that we have today. So in many senses, we have very long continuity. This was the beginning, really, of open access to scholarship and to peer review with these journals that came along then. A large step from there to today's open access policies. This is a big topic of discussion at the 2 meetings I've attended already this week, over the period of the last few days in Taiwan, and is the subject of many more meetings to come. The open access to journal articles has been underway for a couple of decades now and been fairly formalized in the last 10 years by many different countries. Now, open access to journal articles is done by any of several means. One is to publish them through open access journals where the content is immediately available for free to people anywhere who can come and access them. The other is to put a copy of them later, often with a short embargo period, in an institution repository. And I know you're building them at the universities and at Academia Sinica. And we have done so at UCLA, the University of California, as a group. I know that China, through the Chinese Academy of Sciences, is moving very quickly in open access to publications and also open access to data. And there the argument is because so many countries, so many journals, so many funding agencies are requiring people to deposit and make available their data associated with any publication, Should those data go to a repository in the United States, in Europe, in Asia, or do you want to keep them in China, keep them in Taiwan, keep them in places where they're more accessible to your own research community here? So that's been the real move in the last few years, is these requirements for open access to data. I'm going to talk throughout this morning of how we go from there to thinking about a larger infrastructure where we can provide access. This is the repository that serves all 10 campuses of the University of California. So not only UCLA, but UC Berkeley, Riverside, Santa Barbara, San Diego, and so on. And the way we've done this is by creating an intellectual property policy whereby we have the right to deposit at 12-month embargo or less everything that we publish here, and then it becomes widely discoverable and available. I've been putting all of my materials in this and the Associated Beat Press, so you will find the slides for this talk to be up very quickly via my website and into Beat Press and the other publications also. So some of us take it very seriously as a way that we reach out. How do we get from there to data? And this is sort of deliberately a sense of a black hole of falling into the many kinds of data that are out there. These policies from the governments and the funding agencies that require open access start with the premise that people will share their data. How many of you have attended a Research Data Alliance meeting? Good, a number of you. It's a growing, and certainly the CoData and data access people are familiar with this. The precondition, if we're going to improve access to data, is that, first of all, researchers are willing to share their data. Okay? And that is often the biggest barrier of all, because we don't have that many incentives. And I'm going to work through all of these over the course of, again, the talk this morning. Certainly, we get rewards for publication. Those are the basis by which people are hired, by which they're promoted, and move on, be traded with other universities. It's a considerable amount of effort to take the data from your research project and to make those available, because you've got to document them. It takes metadata, provenance information, software, and other kinds of documentation and tools. And here the question is, will the researchers do it? Will the librarians do it? Will some other party be involved in doing it? Scholars certainly share and collaborate, but they also compete with each other. Whoever gets to the finding first may get the Nobel Prize, may get the big job, may get the big award. And lastly are the questions of control and ownership. We're in a great period of turmoil around the intellectual property around publications. The intellectual property around data is even more messy as things are changing. There's still seats down front. Come on in. Okay, good. Most of the talk is about big data. And again, big data is something that is very poorly defined. We at least think of big data in these three ways: that it's the greatest, it's big in terms of the volume, the amount of data. It might be big in the rate of change, the rate at which it's coming at you, but it can also be big in terms of the variety or the complexity. My research group has been studying data use in different sciences for the last 15 years or so, and we increasingly find that the challenges of managing data are more associated with the variety of data than with the sheer amount of data that you have coming at you. Also, I think what is not sufficiently recognized here is that working with new kinds of data, with new and novel methods is required. And we have a hard time interpreting what that means. This is a very famous cover of Wired magazine from 2008. How many of you have seen this before? It's a popular slide mostly because we hate it. Okay. Because this was one, they have backtracked a good bit since, but here the idea is we've got all the data in the world we need. All you need to do is find it, mine it, and compare it, and you will have all the answers. You don't need theory, you don't need method. It says theory is dead. Well, in fact, theory is not at all dead. It's all about pulling together good models. And that's, again, one of the challenges of sharing data is you need to know not only what are in the data, but more about why they were collected and know about the methods and the assumptions that were made. This is the most famous data failure lately. As you can see from the very bottom, right up to the very end, almost all of the major US polls predicted Hillary Clinton by anywhere from 75 to 99%. Okay. She trusted the data, the Democratic Party trusted the data. They had the data, they had the numbers, but clearly they weren't the right numbers and they weren't interpreting them correctly. Okay. The other side also had numbers and they were running different kinds of numbers and they were interpreting them in a very different way. So it's, it's a political example, but I think it's one that certainly shows how you have to be very careful about what kind of trust that you put in your numbers, put in your methods, and put in your data. Which brings us to this more general problem. When you dig into those many policies around open access to data, you will have great difficulty finding a definition of data. Data means many different things to many people. I'm going to have several examples of how one person's signal is someone else's noise, that people can be working side by side, they think they're talking about the same thing, but in fact, they have very different senses of what the data are, what the words are, what the meanings are. On the talk on Thursday and a bit yesterday, I used this example of Marie Curie's notebook, where if you're in digital humanities or digital cultures, you might be particularly interested in her style of work as one of the earliest and most famous women scientists. A paleographer would work on her handwriting, whereas a scientist might look for early evidence of a particular finding and when the hints of it came in the first notebook. I'll have an example from the Pisa Griffin later. It's one of the humanities case studies in the book. This is an item that was hiding in plain sight for 400 years on top of the Pisa Duomo in Italy, and they still don't know quite what it is, even though it's been hiding in plain sight. But you've got people from many different disciplines working on it. The person who got me engaged in this project is an archaeometallurgist. He's half archaeology, half metallurgy. He takes little tiny samples and he can trace the metals in them. He can trace the signature of the metal all the way back to the particular mine in Cyprus where the metal came from. But then he has to go into the paper archives to figure out what the trade routes were, how this might have gotten from Cyprus to Egypt or to Italy or to Spain, among the many places they think parts of the object might have been made. So where I ended up after many years of research on data is with this definition. So here the idea is data is not something that is static, it's something that's very dynamic, it's something that is in the eye of the beholder. It's when you decide that little scrap of metal, the evidence you can get from it is data, or when you decide that you can read the Islamic writings and the Christian writings on the side of it, that those inscriptions might become data as well. So the idea here is that data are, they're not stuff, they're not things, they're not, usually not objects. More often they're observations, but it's when you use them as evidence of some phenomena that we begin to think of them as data for the purposes of research or scholarship. Now let me talk for a few minutes about some examples of the different kind of research we've been doing of looking at how people create data, how they use and manage it. The Center for Embedded Network Sensing is the first National Science Foundation Science and Technology Center that was awarded to UCLA with 4 other universities, Caltech, University of Southern California, UC Santa Barbara, UC Riverside, UC Merced, were all part of it as well. So I was one of the founding co-investigators, and my students and I spent 10 years working with them in the field. They built all kinds of interesting sensor networks that would work in the water, in the air, in the ground, 3-dimensional, a lot of breakthroughs on the technologies, breakthroughs on new kinds of science. About 3/4 of the participants were from computer science or engineering. They wanted to build better networks, build better algorithms. People who were information theorists in electrical engineering were part of this. Mechanical engineering, environmental engineering, many dissertations came out of this work. But then they were partnering with people from these different sciences who needed new technologies to ask new questions, to compare things that they never could be compared before. So my students were out in the field. They fell into quicksand. They helped lay a seismic transect across the Andes, across Peru. Got to do many interesting things to see what were data. One of the people we interviewed, one of the engineers who was building these networks, said, temperature is temperature. If my sensor networks give me the same answer 2 days in a row, they're working. Actually, the first parts of the project, they spent a lot of time on battery life and just plain keeping the sensor networks alive and moving. This is what happened by someone who works side by side in the field. You ask a biologist, one of his partners, the same thing about defining temperature, and you get this very elaborate discussion of what is actually meant. He has international standards, including standards developed by CODATA, that are the reference points for him to publish in a biology environmental sciences journal. He has to say exactly what the technology was, how it was calibrated, how it was used. He didn't trust the networks his partners in engineering were building until he put 3 different sensors side by side and let them run for 365 consecutive days. Okay? 2 days in a row was not data to him. He couldn't trust it until it had a much larger investment. So we see these kinds of comparisons all over the place. This is another one, Peter Darch, who was our postdoc from Oxford and is now an assistant professor at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, took some of these pictures for us. This is an international collaboration, including some from Asia. One of the boats is from Japan, where they go out for these month-long cruises and they drill under the ocean floor and they bring up these cores and they're looking for different kinds of microbial life. At least the biologists were working with the geomorphologists, paleontologists, others are looking for striata, they're looking for fossils, they're looking for other kinds of things. So many different sciences can get these. As you can imagine, this is extremely expensive science to do. When you get one of those cores, you keep it, you want to get as much data from it as possible. This is a storage unit that is at Texas A&M. There's actually a storage unit in, I believe, Japan for the Asian Pacific region. This one takes the Atlantic, and there's another one for the North Seas that is in Europe, and they share together. Okay. So they drill this long core, they cut it in half, and half of it gets sliced up for the scientists who are on that cruise, and the other half gets stored. Okay. How cold do you think that is? Okay. That's a cold storage. Okay. If you store it at -4 centigrade, the people doing physical sciences can continue to use it for long periods of time. To use it for biological sciences, you need to store it at -80 centigrade because all the life, fades away and dies very quickly. So that decision that they had to make on the boat about what temperature they're going to store that core at completely determines what science can be done from that physical specimen for the rest of the time. Okay. So these are the kinds of things where people are side by side arguing about who gets a slice of that, because their career may depend on getting a slice of a particular piece from under the sea. Here's the last example, is the one of the Pisa Griffin. This object is about this high. It's made of metal. It was on top of the Pisa Duomo for 400 years. A replica is now there. This one is sitting in a museum nearby. They have not only the archaeologists and the metallurgists working on it, but they have art historians, cultural historians, engineers. This thing has been scanned and modeled to the sub-nanoscale. They have terabytes of data modeling this object. So art history is not something we used to think of as a big data field, but it's become a very big data field and a very interdisciplinary field when these people come together and try to exchange ideas, try to exchange knowledge, say, what is this thing? And if you're interested in those areas, or the Chinese Buddhist philologist case that I talked about on Thursday at the Digital Archives and Digital Humanities, those are both in the Humanities chapter of the book. Now you have a sense of what data are. Let's go back to publications and about some of the relationship between them. The Academia Sinica library, no doubt, has lots of things that look like this. These PDFs that you can scribble on, make notes, and decide what you want to do with. Okay, those are still publications. That's the familiar kind. But now that they're digital, and now that we can put links between them, this is how we're thinking about publications. Okay? Not as objects that stand alone to be read within the four corners by anyone who knows that field well enough, but rather to think of them as a network, that you can follow things like the citation traces, and we would like to be able to follow them from the citation trace to the data sets, to the software, to the documentation that goes with it. So that's part of what's at stake. That's why these major publishing companies are investing in buying up smaller companies. They're buying up things like Mendeley, things like the social SSRN, the Social Sciences Research Network, are being bought by publishers because the data are so valuable, because you can make these kinds of relationships between them. But again, the maps that you can make are only as good as the quality of data and the quality of methods that are underneath them. And as we rush toward judgment on bibliometrics and H-indexes and G-indexes and some of the things that we talked about last week, we've got to be very concerned about the methods. We tried to do some of the mapping with some of the earlier technologies through this work that we did with the embedded sensor networks. This is a piece that came out in about five or 6 years ago, 2010, in ASIST, where we mapped a life cycle. Now, this is a life cycle specific to sensor networks. If you're working in digital cultures, maybe you're looking for old Roman ruins, you would be doing a very different kind of life cycle. But this was a map to show all of the different artifacts, all the different kinds of data and evidence and documentation that get thrown off, that get created, almost data exhaust, as some people would say, in the process of doing a project. You started with your design, you got the grant, you built the methods, you had a plan, you had field notes, you picked up lab notes. Those are going to be captured, they're going to be cleaned, they're going to be reused. By the time it becomes a publication, there's many, many other pieces that are out there. So if you're going to make sense of the data associated with it, you would want to know more about those other pieces and how they link together. This is object reuse and exchange. It's one of the, in the WC3 and IETF frameworks of emerging standards and ways to mark things up. So we took this down to a very fine, granular level, trying to say, what does it take to do not just the syntactic markup, the technical links, but the semantic markup, to be able to say not just these things are related, but how they are related. Ideally, you'd like to say this is a subset of this documents that, this is the first data set that came from this project, this is a later one, this is a corrected one, this is the calibration data set, this is the metadata, this is the provenance. But this was extremely labor intensive to do. There were 4 people, a couple years work, and a couple of very good graduate students, one with a degree in engineering and one with a degree in computer science and astrophysics that pulled this together. Okay. So we want to do those relationships. What are those relationships between the publications and the data? Some people in the big data world and even in the data science world, particularly in the biosciences, are saying things like the journal article is just a container of data, it's just a wrapper of data. And anyone who's worked in the social sciences, in language, in rhetoric, will tell you otherwise. The journal article, it tells a story. It tells a story to a particular audience. You choose details, you leave some details out, you choose what the narrative is going to be. So publications they're not just wrappers, they're arguments. You're trying to convince the peer reviewers, convince the audience that you have the right finding, the right set of methods, the right set of data. So again, we need to have those things tied together if we're going to support the arguments. You can use the same set of data to make different arguments, and you can make different arguments with the same set of data. Okay. Stepping back again to the questions of data citation, where we did the workshop, the workshop on Monday, here was to say, what's happening as we move from data being part of the process of scholarship to more products of scholarship. When we take them out of the laboratory, out of the library, out of your computers and desktops, we're taking what is processed and we're turning it into a product. We're trying to make it mobile and move it out. So they've always been there. We've always used data. That's not new. It's the extraction, it's observing them, it's calling them out as something specific. One of the things that we did in the sensor data, and we've done in some of the others as well, is to start to look at those relationships between the publications and the data. Most of the way that these policies are being implemented is to ask people to deposit a data set that is associated with a specific journal article. But in fact, we don't find a one-to-one relationship between an article and a data set. People will do research for a long period of time, and they will slice and dice their data in different ways. They will combine things from different sources and different pieces to bring them together and to make sense of them. So when you say release the data associated with this paper, well, you're not likely to want to release your entire career's worth of work, but it's also very hard to divide up what piece of this is. It's easier in some areas of the sciences than it is certainly in the humanities to divide up and do this kind of mapping. Okay. So let's do a little bit of data citation. Those of you who have already heard the whole bit, I hope I'm giving a bit different spin on some of the questions here today, there's a big movement, and I'll show you a couple of slides from the manifesto, of encouraging people to cite not only the other readings, the books and the articles at the end of the paper, but also to cite the data sources, especially if the data sources are in some kind of repository. Also encouraging people to deposit your own data and then to put a citation to your own data, so when you get the article, you know where to find the data. So it's a way to give people credit for those data sets. It's a way to attribute the sources, but it's most important of all is it serves discovery. It's a way you can find out what exists, where it is, how you might be able to retrieve it. Data citation is not simply a mapping from one to the next. It's much more about how you describe it. And this example is one, certainly very familiar, of bibliographic citation. This one on the left is from law, where you often have more on the page of footnotes than you have of citations. And in the social sciences, particularly, you tend to put the formats, the references at the end. Now, those of you who heard the data citation talk, don't give the answer to this question. But how many different formats, these are just two, how many different formats do you think are out there and are being used for say, journal publication? Okay. How many say 10? 100? Raise your hands. Okay. 1,000? 5,000? 10,000? Okay. You know the answer already. Okay. The answer is over 8,000. Okay. And I took that number from Zotero, which is a very highly used open access bibliographic reference manager. Zotero supports something like 8,400 different citation formats. So you can put in your metadata, your author, your title, your subject, and pick which one of those 8,400 you want it to render it properly. Okay. We cannot begin to agree on how you cite a journal article. How are we going to agree on how you cite data? Okay. There's no way we're going to come up with any single way that's going to support astrophysics and astronomy and archaeology and zoology. We've got to have some degrees of flexibility. And again, I showed this slide yesterday of showing on myself, and this is a concern, again, it's a concern for measurement, and it's a concern for too much belief in data, where I ran those numbers, the 2014 numbers, the last time I was up for my own review, and at that point I was listing a little over 200 publications on my Vita that I submitted, and Google Scholar found 380 of those 200. Okay. They're finding about twice as many as I'm officially listing. Okay. So they're finding variant forms, they're counting slide decks, they're counting all kinds of things that my dean would not count as a peer review publication. But the numbers are very nice. And then you look at what you get in Web of Science, and that's pretty nice coverage. Although it's hard to find all the different variants. Scopus, the Elsevier product, which UCLA has since canceled a subscription, most of the UC campus have canceled it, only found 77 of them. It's strong. I tend to publish in the sciences and computer sciences, some in communication, social sciences. Scopus is obviously stronger for more recent work and in the humanities and social sciences. So I sure wouldn't want my dean to see the Scopus number. I would like my dean to see the Web of Science number or the Google Scholar number. Okay. And again, look at the difference in the H indexes from 14 to 45. You know, what do those numbers mean? They're indicators, but as we go a little mad at countries around the world saying, publish in the right impact factors, publish in the right journals, well, what's the right journal? I've published very heavily, and yet you get this kind of dirty data. Because it's based on dirty data because not only because of those 8,000 different formats that are being mined, but because of inconsistency. People leave out middle initials, they leave out page numbers, they leave out editors' names. And I found 643 variants by going through all of them to try to say how many were in there. Of cited 3,000 times in the current Web of Science. So it says 2,000. I found 3,100 under all those different variants. So it depends, again, on your method, what you're looking for, and what you think you're counting. The altmetrics, which in my world is neither alternative nor is it metrics, it's indicators. But this is a manifesto. There's a whole company, probably several companies, that are built on generating these kinds of metrics for you that says we should consider not just the citations, but we should consider the downloads. We should consider the page views. We should consider many others of the kinds of things that we might look at. This is one that we put in PLOS One, well-known open access science journal 3 years ago. These numbers up in the top right, these numbers with the nice pointer you can here, these numbers, these are automatically generated by one of those companies that does altmetrics. Now the 49, that looks like a citation figure. I dove down underneath it. Turns out that comes from Scopus. Google Scholar finds 100 for this. Scopus finds 49. Crossref finds 50. So even here where you've got a number, that number is going to vary. And that's wonderful. It's almost, more than 20,000 different people have viewed this. But are those people, or is that Google Scholar or Google and others finding it and showing it to somebody? What does that mean? So again, we're working on the changing nature and changing uses of these data. So we've got the Leiden Manifesto. Leiden in the Netherlands is arguably the best and most comprehensive groups that is looking on evaluating scholarship and looking for much more holistic ways. You've got the Declaration on Research Assessment. This was a pushback from the Society for Cell Biology that got people to sign on to this. There's a number of pushbacks of concern on the way those data are being used. So back to the relations between publications and data and how we attribute these sources. Part of what's going on here is the fundamental difference between what's a data set and what is a journal article. A journal article is something that you should stand alone. You should be able to read it without needing other software other than, say, a browser or reader. And we kind of know how to negotiate who gets first and last authorship and corresponding. But it's much less clear when we work with data about who owns it, who should get credit, about all the different parts that need to be brought together. We've been working, like I said, on data management and preservation. More people are starting to look at software preservation and tying those pieces together. These are the several hundred pages that were written by the CoData ICSD in 2 reports, trying to get a broader sense of what's going on with data citation, why it's not just analogous to bibliographic citation, and how we can bring these together. The Force 11 that was mentioned yesterday, this is the joint declaration. It built upon the CoData ICSD. It brought Force 11 in, which is another very interesting group looking at changing scholarly communication, and came up with these. Originally there were 10, it's down to about 8. They do say in the fine print, you can't read there, that these principles are grouped for interpretation rather than order of importance. But people tend to think of the first one of importance, of saying we should consider data to be just as important as journal articles in evaluating people or as scholarly objects. I think that's debatable, but this is the sort of discussion that's going on in the world of trying to promote new kinds of scholarship and look at what's changing and different value for different kind of research objects. The part of what this is about is attributing, is who should get credit. In the U.S., I understand in Taiwan, certainly in Europe, a very large part of the research enterprise is people who are employed on grants, on soft money, on year-to-year contracts. Those people do incredibly important work, and yet there's not a really good career path for them. They often go from project to project, university to university, institute to institute, and so much of it is behind the scenes. It's the calibration, it's directing a lab, it's a data manager, it's somebody running the natural reserve site out in the field. They don't get credit. Should we be using data citation as a way to give them credit? Now, that's going to make a great mess of the bibliographic and cataloging record system to try to do that, but it might be a way to get other people kinds of credit and things that will help them along their careers as we think about what this infrastructure should look like with so many people on what we call soft money. Hard money being the permanent career positions, the tenure track positions, and soft money being the short-term contract kinds of positions. And similarly, when you want to cite the data or find out what is in it, if you want to reuse data, it's usually one of these people you want to talk to, not to the principal investigator, because it was delegated. Okay. So discovery and interpretation, rather than just wanting to read a journal article, you want to be able to open that document. You want to be able to identify, is this an SPSS file? Is this something that has SGML markup? Is this a FITS file from astronomy? You need to know what it is to know what software and what version to open it. This is where we need different kinds of metadata, and we hope that we're encouraging the library and archives community to take an even larger role of thinking about the different kinds of documents that we need, the different ways to describe as data move from community to community over time. Okay. So that takes us to questions of interpretation. A number of fields are claiming they have a reproducibility crisis. Other fields think that that's just complete nonsense. It depends on the field, depends on what you mean by replication, by reproducibility, by verifiability. It's what you do it very differently in genomics than you do in, say, seismology, where you can't repeat the earthquake from one time to the next. Okay. So the methods, we'd like to document all of these things, but certainly to document the software and the code. The intellectual property is increasingly an important part of the metadata and the provenance. When you find that object, once you can open it, then the question becomes, can I use it standalone? Can I merge it with something else? Who do I need to give credit to? Who do I need to ask for permission? Can I put it in a book? Can I put it in an article? How many copies can I make? What resolution can I make those copies from? Those are all intellectual property questions, and they're relatively unexplored when it comes to data and what it means you can do with them. Even questions of bibliography. I put this up here. You would think that that list of publications that we write would be something pretty open, not too sensitive. But in fact, if somebody can take your bibliography and build another map out of it and not give you credit for it, or use it to evaluate you and make decisions about whether you're going to be offered a job or offered admission to a program, these are becoming very sensitive because of the different ways that they can be used. UCLA is finally implementing a full digital portfolio for faculty to go up for review and assessment. It's been surprisingly paper-based because nobody can agree on who should have access to it. And the wars among the faculty around things like teaching evaluations, bibliographic records, letters of reference, who has access to them, how you manage them, are unbelievably sensitive. Okay, so things like the bibliography, don't think that's the easy stuff. It's actually not so easy. Although faculty on both sides of the Pacific can fight about almost anything. Persistence and identity. These are some of the more technical issues. We did talk about those at the data citation workshop. The persistence here at the top, that's probably the most important thing to look at, is not all data are worth keeping. Generally, we try to keep journal articles indefinitely, but long-lived is a term that was coined by the National Academy of Sciences in the US a long time ago to mean data that last long enough that you have to migrate them to some other form of technology. Permanent might be things like the very old records we would like to be able to get back to. Certainly you got things from many prior dynasties, and you would like to have access to those. But we have a number of different ways to do those. How many of you have an ORCID? Only a few. Okay, but a few of you do. ORCID is the Open Researcher and Contributor ID. And journals are starting to require that. And I think it's going to be especially important in Asia because there are many DT Lees out there. We know you, but there's a whole lot of you in those databases. Okay, lots of Lins, lots of Chens, lots of Chungs in those databases. And you would like to get the right DT Lee, and you can do it by getting that 16-digit number. And as journals start to require that upon submission, that will get tied to the bibliography, and you use it to claim your publications. But VIAF is, we'll see how many librarians in the room. Who knows what VIAF is? Okay. You're not even a librarian. Very good. The Virtual International Authority File. Okay. So there's different standards, different communities. ISNI is the international standard for name identification, and that tends to get used for historical names. The British Library uses that fairly extensively. Okay. So let's start to pull these pieces back together again. One is how do we actually go about releasing data? That varies by what kind of science, what kind of scholarship that you do. These first 2 points about centralized and decentralized, those are among our major research questions as we look across these sciences right now. Is you've got something like the Sloan Digital Sky Survey, the Large Synoptic Survey Telescope. ALMA was one that was in the Academia Sinica briefing this morning. You're spending a decade, sometimes 2 decades, sometimes $1 billion, billion US dollars, even more than Taiwan dollars, trying to build these things. That's a massive investment. So you're designing the archive, the LSST, the Large Synoptic Survey Telescope. Half of the budget is for the data archive. It's being built, distributed in about 5 different sites around. You've got great consistency. That's the point of doing it this way. Big repository, then everybody can use it later. That's very different from genomics, where every little lab is doing things its own way, and then you're trying to combine them later. It's a very different metadata problem, a different provenance. It's a different kind of scholarship, and it's going to affect what kind of infrastructure we build and those relationships. We have aggregators like the university repositories, and then some commercial ones are growing. People will post them on their own websites, but that's not a very good sustainability model. That might disseminate, you might get short-term discovery, but 1 year, 2 year, 5 years from now, good luck finding those things again. The repositories and that investment, that curation, is about the only way you're going to get sustainability. We also found in SENS that many people who would never think of putting their data in a repository are willing to share it with another colleague if they ask nicely and say why it is they want it. They're willing to put in some extra effort to describe those data and make them useful, to do a partnership. That advances science, but it doesn't scale very well. So when we think about infrastructure and sustainability, that last one is effective science, but not so much scalability or sustainability. What we need is more data scientists. Okay? And we're turning librarians and archivists into data sciences. We've also done some surveys of looking at the kinds of programs that are being offered. The ones from computer science and business fields tend to be focused on sort of the early to middle stages of the life cycle. Once you've got the data, how do you crunch it, model it, make images out of it, explain it to other people, where the library and archives fields are concerned with that early stage of how do you create and manage data in the first place, and then how do you curate it, keep it, make it useful for a longer term. What we need is to get the people from the library and archives community working more closely with people from the data science communities in computer science and in management fields so we can cover that larger arc. That's what it's going to take to sustain access to scholarship. And I teach 2 courses, a beginning and an advanced course, on data curation and management and policy at UCLA, and those students do very, very well on the job market, as you can imagine. My PhD grads also are doing very, very well with this kind of background. I post them all on my website. I'm happy to share the syllabi for developing courses in Taiwan and elsewhere. So this is more what we need in some of these curricula, is to teach not just about documentation and metadata. We need to look at provenance much more directly. Questions of how do we select what data are worth keeping? How do we appraise the value? How do we determine what's most likely to be reused? how you migrate, and there's a small section on some of the commons kinds of economic issues in the book also. This is sort of the larger and longer term sets of issues is when you think about sustainability, are you thinking about keeping those data available so that you can use them later, the same investigators or your colleagues or your lab? Are you concerned with your collaborators now and in the next few years? By moving farther out, as we go along this stage, it's going to take far more work, far more curation, far more investment to move from reusing it yourself to saying, how can we reuse it in the future? I mean, the things in the Tang Dynasty that you still have here, and large portions of it even here in Taiwan, someone made an investment that said that's worth keeping. Today's digital records are unlikely to survive centuries, and certainly not unless substantial investments are made in them. And you can't invest that in all of them, so we need to have the dialogue about just which ones are worth keeping and what the criteria should be. These are some of the things we find that scholars in all fields are concerned about, is what kinds of requirements they have to respond to from their funding agencies, university policies for data ownership. Let's see, what is the Academia Sinica policy on data? Do you own your data from your research? Does Academia Sinica own it? Yes. Do you know what the criteria are for what it depends on? Okay. But submitting the data is not the same as owning it. And so that's also where it gets messy, is you can put data in a repository, but you still own it. And sometimes you can take it back out and sometimes not. And sometimes you can put it in and you can lock it and force people to come and ask you for it directly, even though the institution is holding it. Okay. Very, very complicated. The University of California owns my data. Very few faculty know that. Very few graduate students know that. But it's a clause from about 1957 in the Academic Personnel Manual that is only invoked when there's big fights. When one university tries to take a database from another, then they pull out that clause and say, guess what, this is part of your employment agreement. Okay. So this, again, is really unexplored territory, and very few people know really what's being held. Okay. We've also got open records laws, certainly in the US and many parts of the world, where someone can come for political reasons, for scientific reasons, and say, I want your data. And that often comes up with sensitive things like climate change research, tobacco research, others like that. But these those kinds of laws can be used as weapons against faculty, weapons against researchers, to try to get their data before they are actually ready to release it or before they're required to release it. This is another tension that we see emerging, and it's got some privacy, some intellectual property, some ownership, some infrastructure tensions between the many stakeholders involved. Okay. And the publication data, as I said, there's many different things going on here. I didn't even get into learning data, which I have on one more slide, is when you have public-private partnerships, when you have a company that gets spun off with a university, or increasingly universities want private partnerships, how are you going to share the data and share the ownership across those? So these are just a few of the emerging issues. UCLA, which has been a leader in privacy and in data management areas, commissioned this task force, and jointly commissioned by the Academic Senate and by the provost, the chief academic officer of the administration. And I've co-chaired that with Kent Wada, who is the chief privacy officer for UCLA, and we've worked together on these policy issues for a very long time. So these are the kinds of questions we were asked. Our report is now out. It's freely available at that site, and I'll put these slides up shortly on my website, and you're welcome to put them up here too. But what we're realizing is we've got many kinds of data, not only data about research, but especially data about students that's highly sensitive, and it falls through the cracks. It's not protected by human subjects. It's not protected by the educational practices. It's not protected by PII, personally identifiable information laws. It's not required under HIPAA, the medical laws, okay? And the notice and consent, we require, you're supposed to tell people if you're collecting data about them and get their consent. That's necessary, but it's no longer sufficient. People will say, oh, sure, you can get what's on my iPhone, what's on my Android phone. It's not sensitive. I don't do anything you should worry about. But in fact, it's when those data are pulled together. When you think of what we have on students, and you probably have on students also, carrying a card around, that card will get you not only library books, it will get you pizza, it will get you food, it will get you a door access. We have everything up on websites. We know if you were doing your homework at 2 o'clock in the morning or 2 o'clock in the afternoon. We know when you submit things. We have amazing dossiers on students, and they don't really think about that. So who is going to control those data, and under what conditions, and how do you manage them? These are these breaking issues in thinking about infrastructure. And we wrote this report not just for use at UCLA, but we tried to write it so the findings were useful to universities, certainly around the US and beyond. So I encourage you, if you're concerned about these kinds of issues, to look at those. Okay. To wrap up again, here's the table of contents from the book, where I tried to work through a number of different questions about the changing nature of scholarship and what's at stake as we build a new kind of knowledge infrastructure. An infrastructure it's the technology, it's the people, it's the policies, it's how they all interact together, and the knowledge that we produce is the knowledge that goes into that is the knowledge infrastructure. So what Taiwan builds in terms of how universities capture their own material, how Academia Sinica does, how those work together, who's responsible for keeping them, that's all part of that knowledge infrastructure. So the first part frames the problem. Why are we having this conversation? Why did we get this wonderful audience of 100 or more people here to talk about this? Because there's so much at stake. This is a critical turning point. The case studies are to give examples based on the models in the first part of what's changing within fields. And then lastly, to bring it all together, is those questions of releasing and sharing and what that means and how you reuse. The data citation is in the chapter 9, the credit attribution and discovery, and the last chapter is for the librarians and archivists, but also for the university provosts, for the presidents of universities, presidents of national academies, who should be concerned about what of the fabulous knowledge produced by an institution like this you're going to keep, why you should keep it, and for how long you're going to keep it. Because it really does all come back to this knowledge infrastructure. This is a report that we did several years ago from a workshop jointly funded by National Science Foundation and by Sloan Foundation. And I love the image because you really see the string and baling wire, the old technology, the new technology, trying to get all these pieces pulled together to make sense of things. It's a constantly changing environment. We change policy on data, on publications, on promotion, on bibliometrics. We change tools, we change software. One company buys another company, one publisher buys another. Universities merge, they split, departments merge and split. It's a constantly changing environment. And the decisions that we make now are the decisions that are going to determine what kind of knowledge infrastructure we have within individual countries, but between countries, because scholarship, of course, is international across the Pacific and around the world. Some acknowledgments to my brilliant research team, graduate students and postdocs, and now an assistant professor back at UCLA. And these are the people, if you come and visit us, that you will share offices and come and visit and work with. So thank you very much. try to leave plenty of time for questions and discussion.
Thank you, Professor Borgman. Now we open to discussion. Yeah.
You might want to give him a microphone. Oh, good, thank you.
Yes, being a librarian, naturally I was thinking how to provide access to data. And when it comes to journal article, journal publication, now we can do federated search. So we can search articles from different institutional repository. And that's because we have this shared protocol standard and metadata. And I was wondering if there's any initiative or equivalence of federated search in the realm of data. Probably not universal, but in certain domain, is it possible to have this kind of federated search? So when we do search, we are not limited to certain institute.
So the question is about federated search across data sets.
Right.
So far, that's very difficult. The first being first of all, people don't agree on what are data up front. Then they describe them very differently. And at most, if you look at some of these examples, it's a very simple citation, sort of author, a title, a project, and a digital object identifier or someplace to get it. Rarely do those have enough description. The data repositories also vary considerably in the amount of description they put in. There's ones like ICPSR, which is the big social science data archive in the US, but it's international. And the UK Data Archive, who is also here for this, where they describe data right down to the level of the variable. So you can say who has data on household income compared to age, compared to ethnicity, where most archives do not have that level of description. So the ability to do a federated search, the ability to do any search is only as good as the metadata. But let's turn that around. Is back to the question about who actually does the work. Is somebody's a specialist at archaeology or astronomy is not an information scientist or a specialist, and they can think about how you might describe it for somebody else in exactly their same specialty. They have great difficulty describing things so that somebody else could find it later for another purpose. And this is where the information science expertise that librarians bring is absolutely critical. So we're trying to get more librarian data scientists to work with scholars at the very beginning of projects, because if you can help people design their data and management processes in such a way that they can reuse their own data better, then it's more likely to be usable later by somebody else. Okay? But if you sit and wait for somebody to show up and give it to you, it's probably not going to happen.
Any other questions? Yes?
You talk about how to provide incentive to researchers to share their data to other researchers for public use. But when the data collectors are maybe government organization, it seems to us, as to our experience, it's often that we are in need of the kind of persuasive talk for the government to share their data for research use, or especially when the data are involved in micro-level data, such as involving human beings or firm-level data. So do you have any practice about how to cooperate with government organization?
So I hear at least two questions in there. One is about the difference between data sharing incentives between universities and government agencies, and the other is about releasing sensitive data such as human subjects data. Is that correct? Okay. We'll take them one at a time. So the first question then about government, that is, there's carrots and there's sticks. This is one where the enforcement is a bit more of a stick. And because government research institutions are more salaried employees that, generally speaking, don't have as much autonomy as faculty have, it's often easier to get them to sort of force them, to the extent that you can, to release those data. The US federal policy, the Holdren memos from the Obama administration, require all federal agencies that fund $100 million per year or more of research to release their data and release their publications. So this is just within the last few years. So I was on a panel for the US Department of Energy trying to help them. And they have a real knowledge infrastructure problem internally because their research structure is not set up. They don't have the data repositories, they don't have those things set. So they're in a position of having to build that framework just like everybody else is. I had a follow-on conversation with Louise Corti last night of the UK Data Archive. And that archive is social sciences, as you well know, and anyone who gets funding from ESRC, the Economic and Social Research Council, is required to offer it to them, to a central repository. However, EPSRC, EPSRC, the physical, is it Engineering, Physical, and Research Sciences Council? Physics is in there. There's the Engineering and Physical Sciences Council. They went a different route. They required every university to set up its own data repository as a condition of getting any funding from the research agency. So here you've got one country, two different research councils, both under RCUK, the Research Councils of UK, who took very different approaches. Okay. So again, that's the kind of thing, Taiwan, this is a discussion to be had here, is what's the right architecture? And there's no simple answer to it. On the sensitive data, that was talked about a bit yesterday also, is we do have some ways of anonymizing. Anonymization is rarely perfect. If you have enough other data to match to it, you can often re-identify things. The major agencies like the UK Data Archive, ICPSR, I'm on the council, it's the one I know best. They have 4 tiers of data depending on the degree of sensitivity. Things that can be completely anonymized down to things that are labeled toxic. Okay, you could not possibly let them out, they're so sensitive. The toxic ones, or radioactive, they sometimes call them, those you have to travel to Ann Arbor, Michigan, sit in a closed room, use their computer, take off what you want, and then leave it with them, and their specialists will spend time deciding if you've taken anything in such a way that could possibly be sensitive, and only after the staff have gone through it again will you be allowed to use it. And you have to sign many layers of agreements where you promise never to attempt to re-identify it. So we have procedures for it, but it was more detailed than was worth going into here. But this is back to the question about federating across fields. That level of sensitivity is not something that applies in most other fields. Okay? And the way in which you would classify it would be very domain specific. In the back.
I think the lady.
My question is how to make sure our explanation to data is right, not wrong. For example, this time president election, many American media made the wrong prediction to this president election. So my question, want to ask Professor, thank you.
About how you know if your data are right or wrong.
Yeah,
right. Elections are one of the few cases where you actually know if you got it right or wrong. Because there is a decisive outcome to compare to. In the rest of scholarship, it's much more of a judgment call. If you get a certain kind of result and somebody else can come along later using a similar method and get the same finding, the more consistent that people get findings that begin to converge, then people begin to believe and say this is the truth. Whatever, the history of truth is itself something problematic, which is what Professor Chung and I were discussing much of this weekend. The history of truth is very different across Eastern and Western, across the physical sciences, the life sciences, the humanities. It's a very dangerous territory to get into. So again, it gets to be domain specific. But we do try to get convergence. Let me give you one interesting story, which is where it took a very long time before you had a validation. The theory of plate tectonics causing earthquakes, that was actually proposed in the very early 20th century. And it took 60 years. It wasn't until the 1960s Cold War, with the submarines mapping the ocean floor to see the plates, did people believe it. Because the scientist who proposed it, it was a highly interdisciplinary proposal, and nobody else had enough knowledge across the disciplines to believe him. But it's a very well documented case in the history of science. So maybe your theory will be proven right, but a long time from now.
I have a question regarding the ownership of data. You said that the data belongs to an institution. I imagine that if, for example, if I publish a scholarly work or patents and everything, those things are variables, the institution would like to claim the rights, and it's rightly so. But the data, when it comes to data, I wonder if the data is manipulated, illegally obtained, and would the institution like to own it? I don't think that the institution would like to own them, right? Because when you have ownership, owner will be responsible for those illegally whatever substance, right? But when you publish something data, when data itself, I'm not sure whether or not it's right to belong to a certain a body, or somebody who produced data should be responsible. But I don't know about the ownership. If the ownership should belong to the institution, in that case, the institution will be held responsible for the, I don't know.
For the truth, whatever the truth means, yes.
Okay. Yes.
It's a wonderful, I was going to say two-edged sword. I think it's a many-sided weapon. The University of California, like I said, decided decades ago, way before the digital age, that it owned your data. And they did that as more of a defensive move based on the conversations. Because we're bringing this up again now. We're trying to put it on the front page, and let's have a serious discussion about what that means, now that it really matters. And so there was a couple of high-profile cases where that school across town that Elisa Lynn went to, the University of Southern California, hired away a very famous researcher at a University of California campus with the world's biggest Alzheimer's disease database, okay, and moved it across town and changed all the passwords and said it's ours now. We hired him, it's his database, it's now our database. And then it became a war between the university and the private pharmaceutical company that was putting most of the money into it. Okay. As far as I know, it's still in the courts, and it may be in the courts for a while. But because that clause exists, the University of California was in a position to fight your alma mater. Okay. And so that's when it comes up. So we would like to turn that around and say, okay, well, if you own it, that means you're going to take care of it forever. And I said, no, we don't do that. But intellectual property around scholarly publications is handled differently than patents and trademarks. Very different rules. And even the discovery rules changed with the Bayh-Dole Act, 30 years or so ago in the US. So the relationships change. It's really moving targets around this. So it's one thing to claim it because you want to be able to fight about it. It's something else to take responsibility for it. So I think that's something else to take to the Council of Academia Sinica of who owns it and what that means. Every time I talk to you, DT, you have another hard question.
know the difference between data and others' information, for example. So data is just without interpretation of personal thought, right? So my question is, actually in Taiwan, so for example, the Taiwanese government is trying to open some of the data, the national data, for example, geographic data or something, and try to start build some platform to share the data. And but sometimes data is not, it's difficult to interpret. So for most of people, so for example, most people we just trust the spokesman of the government. For example, the energy policy. So people say, okay, we have enough power, but some people just say, show me the data. I don't believe you. So how you interpret the data? So so my question is, could you comment? So all of the data should be shared to make the world better, and how about the attitude of the U.S. government to treat about this thing? Of course, I know they have their concern, but do you encourage people to share all the data?
Well, there's about 10 questions in there. I'll just pick one or two. Let me pick one about the judgment in what are data and about whether you should share all of it. The simple answer is no, you should not share all of your data. I mean, it's simply not possible. We cannot keep it all, and it's too voluminous, and there's too much stuff that could be data. I mean, look around this room. We could look at everybody's shoes, everybody's eyeglasses, everybody's this, that, and the other thing. So many things could be data. We can't possibly capture all of them. There's a well-known paper in our field that's called "Raw Data is an Oxymoron." Okay. That there's no such thing as raw data. Data always comes from somewhere. Judgments are always being made. I have an example early in the astronomy chapter that says, okay, these data, these signals came off this instrument. Some people would call those raw signals. But decisions were made about how to design the instrument. And then before that, decisions about what should be collected and what instrument we should be designing. And then those in turn are based on findings from the previous generation of instruments. It becomes an infinite regress. You know, that there's never an absolute zero starting point for any kind of data or any kind of research project. We're always building on knowledge that came before. So it's a matter of when you document any data, any journal article, if you've ever, anyone who's written a journal article or even a term paper for that matter, you realize how difficult it is to decide what to include and not to include. And so it's the same thing here, is determining what's worth including and what's not. And the terms that are used in libraries are generally a selection, in archives, appraisal, is what's worth keeping and in what form, for whom. But it's also messy because the audience for data changes over time. We had a very interesting panel, I don't know if you came to it, DT, or others who came to the Denver meeting, on the changing nature of what we think open is. And we decided that open is not an act, it's a process. So just because you put it in a repository doesn't mean it's going to stay that way. It may need more metadata as it changes, as new audiences come along. The great example was the snow and ice database, which is now 40 years old. For the first 20 years, these scientists were out there measuring the sea ice, and nobody was paying attention to them. At about 20 years, they realized they had this phenomenal record of the rate at which the glaciers were receding. And then everybody from the news media to school children to environmental activists wanted those data. They were not marked up, they were not curated in a way for other communities to use them. So the following 20 years have been a process of trying to figure out how you make those usable and interpretable to new kinds of audiences. And again, that's why we talk about knowledge infrastructure, not as simple acts, but things that's an evolving process over a long period of time. And it requires a dialogue between many, many stakeholders to do that.
Mr.
Thank you for a wonderful talk. What I would like to have your comment is that for some who are very important in history and whose diaries or personal notes are of great importance to a nation, to a country. So when such person going to die, he or she might comment that his or her notes and personal records has to be deleted. But however, later on, as in Taiwan history, some of such important people had their personal records, notes, diaries published in publicly accessible ways by their families. Do you think, just as you have told us, you make decisions on what kind of data UCLA should collect and how they should do it? So, do we should have those data or diaries or personal notes for national or countrywide importance, or we should respect the very people and destroy those data? Thank you.
He's full of hard questions too. That's really, again, the kind of judgment call it comes down to. Some people on the idea of open government, transparency, open historical record would say everything should be open. Doesn't matter who you embarrass or what is sensitive. Other people would say, no, this is part of the historical record and we need to protect people's privacy, but decide what is part of the cultural history. But there's another piece of it that you didn't mention that the librarians and stewards in the room will be very aware of, is it's one thing if no one talks to that person before he or she passes on. And what you get is boxes full of old computers, floppy disks, zip drives, 20-inch or 20-foot-long tapes, and things that can't possibly be read or made sense of. If you can work with people whose data you know you need to take for cultural heritage early on, then you're not going to put CDs in the dishwasher on the hot cycle trying to get the data off them. I mean, the kinds of things people do to try to make sense of the stuff later is a real problem. And again, that's why we encourage people to work with the librarians and archivists as early as possible to intervene, and so that you know what's on them, you can migrate them. And if you can make those decisions with the person who's going to release them, then you know what his or her wishes are. That might be even better.
Hello, my name is Gabriel. I'm from the Institute of Ethnology, and I was wondering, because in anthropology, open access is pretty popular right now, but mostly at the level of publications. But at the level of data sharing, anthropologists are still a bit suspicious, especially like about sharing field notes and how to share very personal research experiences. So I was wondering if at UCLA, what was your experience with the anthropology side of? Yeah.
Okay, let me comment on anthropology and archaeology, and then we should probably wrap it up. I know that's, you've all been very generous with your time this morning. And there's not a hard line, of course, between anthropology and archaeology, and it's a question, like say, field notes is a good one. Field notes in anthropology would be things like, I had an example early on. They might be very personal, very local, very hard for anyone else to interpret who wasn't in the field. On the other hand, archaeology, which I'm more familiar with, is one of those fields where you can only do the research once, because generally speaking, you destroy the site by digging it up. And historically, those records were not shared. Whoever dug up the site got the records. And then there's laws about who gets the artifacts to go with them. So there's been a real push in archaeology in recent years to share those models, to share those representations. But it's extremely difficult because they don't have agreed upon notation, agreed upon metadata, but you've got the database that Britain runs is one of the best known ones. UCLA runs TDAR, the Digital Archaeological Record, run at the Kansa Institute. So there's certainly movement in that area. The Kanzas are working on that, Eric Kanza and Sarah Kanza. So I think we're going to see differences. The environmental sciences are another that have set up the Dryad repository. Similarly, if you don't keep good climate records now, we're never going to get those again. So the fields that are sharing are the ones that feel a particular kind of obligation to share to increase the kind of knowledge. And then there's others that don't see that kind of aggregation as being critical. So again, there's a lot of domain knowledge, and I think the long-term challenge is finding the right level of abstraction. We can't just build one little thing for this kind of cultural archaeology and this kind of thing for Near Eastern and this for that. We've got to go up a level, but we can't build something that's going to work for archaeology and astronomy. So that's part of why we need more stakeholders at the table, is to discuss what that level of abstraction is, where the commonalities are, where the differences are, and so convening organizations like Force 11, RDA, and others within individual domains, I think are taking on increasing importance to keep that dialogue going and keep that comparison going. So there's a career in there for you. Do you want to pursue that? Okay. Thank you all.
Lecture. Thank you, Professor Borgman, for inspiring us to think deeply, widely, and loudly about the data. Thank you very much.
Thank you.